Maybe it's hardwired into what we are as a species, leaving behind something we'll be known for. A legacy, anything. The want and desire to leave some sort of mark in this strange notion we call life. There are exceptions, of course. Some people avoid fame and popularity altogether, choosing to instead live a life not seeking to make a mark on society. Instead are content with who, what, or where they are. And there's nothing wrong with that. Let's also not forget that even those who struggle to leave their mark on existence may also fail and not be remembered for their deeds and leave behind no lasting legacy. It's absolutely a grim reality, but it shouldn't deter a person from doing what they want to do in life and going for it. This is because whether you realize it or not, you may in fact be leaving your mark on history without ever knowing you're doing so. In some cases, it almost feels like life itself is hitting you over the head with legacy. And that brings us to today's video, because if there was ever a case of unintentionally leaving behind a legacy without intentionally leaving behind a legacy, at least in the realm of entertainment, this is it. Bobby Watson, the man who made a career out of playing Hitler. Because why not? If you've ever watched a movie or show from the 40s, 50s, and even 60s containing an actor playing Hitler, then chances are you've seen a performance by Bobby Watson, the man who holds the record for playing Adolf Hitler the most times on screen in history. Bobby Watson would continuously come back to the role of Adolf Hitler for 3 decades, playing Adolf Hitler a total of 9 times. To put that into perspective, if we were to compare MCU actors to Bobby Watson, as of the making of this video, Robert Downey Jr. has played Iron Man / Tony Stark a total of 10 times, and then you have Captain America / Steve Rogers, played by Chris Evans, a total of 11 times in both major roles as well as cameos. If we moved away from Marvel and looked at Tom Cruise, he's played Ethan Hunt a total of 6 times in Mission Impossible movies, with the 7th and 8th portrayals coming out in 2023 and 2024 respectively. Hell, Daniel Radcliffe's played Harry Potter in 8 different movies. It just goes to show you, some people are born to play heroes, other people are born to play Hitler. According to a CBR article, Kelsey Grammer takes the 10th position in a top 10 as he played Frasier for 20 years on television. So let it be known, Frasier beat Hitler. The point is, Bobby Watson played Hitler a lot. We are jumping a little ahead here, but when you look at a picture of Watson and Hitler side by side, yeah. Ain't exactly spot on, but whoever was in charge of that casting call undoubtedly fulfilled that expectation. So today we are going to take a closer look at the man who holds the record for playing Hitler the most times on screen in history. This is Bobby Watson, the man whose lasting legacy in the film industry was playing Hitler. Bobby Watson was born November 28, 1888, in Springfield, Illinois. It should be noted before we get too far into Bobby Watson's history that there's a lot of conflicting information on his upbringing. Even if we take a quick look at the guy's Wikipedia page, there isn't a whole lot. Nothing you can't find on like IMDb or something like that. And something you're going to notice quite quickly is that a lot of the websites that do talk about Bobby Watson have essentially copy and pasted the same thing from one another. Very basic information that isn't completely accurate. Anyway, if you look at the top of the wiki, there is a citation that needed confirmation stating Bobby Watson's real name was Robert Watson Knucher. And through a Google search on that, I found a Turner Classics movie page on the actor. There's also a couple other places that cite this as his real name, and while this could be a situation again where they're just kind of copying and pasting off one another, I think that this is his actual real name. The Turner page, again, doesn't really tell us too much about Watson other than the information we can already find on IMDb, and it wouldn't surprise me if that's where they got most of their information from. The general consensus across most websites is that when Bobby Watson was a kid, he was first exposed to acting while he sold peanuts at the Olympic Theater in Springfield, Illinois. And it was through this job that he found a passion for theater and acting in general. So understandably, information on an actor who had maybe only 3 leading roles on screen would be hard to come by. Those roles being 1929's Syncopation, which is actually debatable because despite the fact that he has a lot of screen time in the film, he's treated more or less like a co-star, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. The other 2 leading roles being 1943's The Nasty Nuisance as well as 1944's Hitler Gang. When I talk about that, I'm not including his work in shorts, which would be Glorious Vamps and The Stand-Up. But if you do count those, that means Bobby Watson was the lead on screen a total of 5 times out of the 99 film credits that he does have, meaning that 2 of those was playing Hitler. So in fairness to a lot of the online news outlets, finding a lot of information on the actor who wasn't exactly the Clark Gable of his time would be a bit difficult. But it's not impossible, as you'll see, because there is more information out there that actually expands on his pre-Hollywood career more in depth. Information that also contradicts the little peanut vendor fun fact that's on most websites. An article on the State Journal Registry written by Sangamon Link. I know that I'm butchering the name, but Sangamon County is in Illinois, which is where Bobby Watson is from. The article itself also links back to the Sangamon County Historical Society. So Sangamon Link is in fact the historical society writing this article. I'm like 90% sure that's the case, but I couldn't find a definitive answer, but I will have everything linked below for you guys to check out, and I will be referencing these different websites quite a bit. Anyway, no, the article here states that it would have been impossible for Bobby to have been a peanut vendor at the Olympic, as stated online. Sangamon notes that the Olympic opened up when Bobby was 16 in 1904. They instead point to the Gaiety Theater as Bobby Watson's first ever appearance on stage. I couldn't find an exact registry with the theater claiming Bobby Watson's first appearance was here, so unfortunately I can't completely prove that's true, but I'm willing to give Sangamon Link the benefit of doubt. So Gaiety Theater also opened in 1904, but it showed both vaudeville performances and motion pictures of the time, which, as you'll see, Bobby Watson was in many stage performances as the years went by, and leading up to his premiere in motion pictures. As of now, we don't know how or why Bobby Watson decided to become an actor, but I'm willing to say as long as he's not like a time traveler or anything like that, I think it's very easy to say that he most likely got his start at the Gaiety Theater. Even when you look at these two maps, you'll see the Gaiety Theater is only about 2 hours away, while the Olympic is up near Chicago. If I was just speculating, maybe Bobby got his start at the Gaiety Theater working in vaudeville before making his way to Chicago. Which I don't think is impossible because as you'll see towards the end of the video, he was a bit of a vagabond. But the whole peanut thing is just nonsense. I don't even know where that came from. Unless the story was told by Watson himself, because I don't know, maybe in the past he was like a peanut vendor or something. Maybe there's like an obscure interview out there where he does state that, and just over time the people have kind of intermingled both of those pieces of information, but I don't know. Anyway, moving away from speculation, in 1908 Bobby Watson would team with Eddie Dwyer, and they created a comedy routine where Watson would be the straight man in their comedy, while Dwyer played the eccentric one. The duo would break up in 1915, and the article on the State Journal expands on this a bit more with quotes from the Chicago Theatrical Review stating things like, quote, "It is rumored that Bobby Watson has been engaged for a big New York review for next season, and if that is true, it only testifies to the generally accepted theory that ability cannot be long hidden," end quote. Boy, if that ain't the theme of this video. It definitely took him a few more years to find his niche, but whoever wrote that comment was absolutely correct. This is speculation on my part, but most likely the duo broke up as Watson began to become a bigger player on stage in Chicago. Perhaps Watson didn't want to remain in a comedy duo for the rest of his career. Regardless, he would catch his first major break in theater when he would take up the lead role in the Broadway musical Going Up, after replacing another actor named Frank Craven, who you might know as Dr. Harry Brewster in Son of Dracula. Thank you, IMDb. Then from 1919 to 1925, Watson would star in a bunch of theater productions. Irene from November 18, 1919 to June 18, 1921. The Rise of Rosie O'Reilly, which only had a 3-month stint from December 25, 1923 to March 15, 1924. And Annie Dear, which also had a 3-month run opening on November 4th, 1924, and lasting until January 31st, 1925, just to name a few of his theater performances prior to his big screen debut. Save for one image on Bobby Watson's Wikipedia, which shows him in his role for the play Irene, other than that, nothing else has survived to the best of my knowledge in any of his early theater performances. No pictures and no film. It was just the times. The theater was just that. The theater. You either caught the performance, or you didn't. The 20s was a booming decade for entertainment and entertainment growth, but technology-wise, we weren't at the peak that we are now. Hell, if you really think about it, it's only within the last 50 years or so that film preservation basically at all has ever really been a thing. Hey, it's always possible there's a lost reel out there with a Bobby Watson stage performance on there, but all I'll say is don't get your hopes up. I should also mention that places like Playbill and IBDB only have Irene and the Rise of Rosie O'Reilly listed as Bobby Watson's initial performances. For concrete info, again, Sangamon County's website has us covered. I keep bringing up the Sangamon website to give them credit because they really did put in the work, and I feel like without them actually going out and finding a lot of this information, that Bobby Watson's career would mostly be forgotten. As we work our way to 1925, we finally get to Bobby Watson and his major motion picture debut in the film That Royal Girl, a 1925 silent film that unfortunately is completely lost. I mentioned briefly that film preservation wasn't really a thing until like 50 years ago, and that's especially true for silent era films. I'll direct you to a great YouTube video by Dark Corners Reviews, and more specifically their video entitled Celluloid Ghosts Top 10 Lost Films. Now, they don't discuss That Royale Girl specifically, but they do discuss a little more in depth on why a lot of films from the silent era, and even up to the 50s, are just completely lost. Seriously, if you're into older cinema like I am, I think their channel's really good, and I think that you'll really enjoy it overall. Anyway, back to That Royal Girl. Now, there is some info on this film in general, but keep in mind, all the images I'm showing here is all that's available on the film, which is unfortunately not a lot and comes mostly from IMDb. However, the tagline on IMDb states, and quote, Joan Royal, beautiful but naive model who came from the slums, falls for Fred Kettler, the leader of a dance band. When Fred's estranged wife, Adele, is murdered, Fred is arrested and convicted of the crime. Joan believes that the real murderer is Beretta, a gangster who was keeping Adele as his mistress. End quote. The film was directed by D.W. Griffith, famed director of a literal crap ton of films. Gotta address the elephant in the room because he's also the guy that created the controversial Birth of a Nation. And if for some reason you don't know what Birth of a Nation's about, it's literally about the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, and they are portrayed as the heroes in the story. Which, not to downplay the controversy with that, but I do find it kind of hilarious that the debut film of Bobby Watson, who would later go on to be the main guy playing Hitler in the movies, is from the same director who created Birth of a Nation. Life is strange. Now, despite what your personal feelings on The Birth of a Nation is, D.W. Griffith is an important piece of early American cinema. At the very least, pertaining to this particular video, No Royale Girl equals potentially not ever having Bobby Watson on the big screen. And that segues back to That Royal Girl, as it was Griffith's first production under contract by Paramount Pictures, and the film itself being lost kinda sucks. When you look at some of the blurry promotional stills on the poster, the cinematography looks pretty awesome in these few promo shots. Just another piece of early film history that's unfortunately lost to time. And quick side note, apparently Griffith legit didn't want to make this movie, but he was contractually obligated to do so. Life is strange. Anyway, now Bobby Watson, as far as I can tell, did not have a starring role here. He instead played the role of hoofer, and yes, I needed to Google that. And the Google definition of a hoofer is of a professional dancer. Which brings a lot of Bobby Watson's early life full circle here, my theory being that he started off as like a vaudeville dancer before eventually moving over and expanding his skills in theater. Or he became a dancer while working in the theater as an actor. Either way, he was good enough to get a spot in the film. The film premiered on November 21st, 1925 in Chicago, which at the time Bobby Watson was still performing on stage. He had a role in the play American Born, which ran from October 5th, 1925 to December of 1925, and I'm assuming this was in Chicago as well. Again, because the film's lost, we don't know to what extent Bobby Watson's debut film is. However, my guess it was probably a small background role. Then again, the people over at Sangamon County have also stated that no, this was in fact not Bobby's first film. Thanks, IMDb. No, instead his first film was supposedly in 1920's The Greatest Love starring Vera Gordon. I think. While I was shooting this, I couldn't help but laugh at the fact that I've said I can't confirm this a lot. And that's because there's a lot of stuff in Bobby Watson's past that we just don't have a definitive answer for as of right now. However, this is one of the situations where I can't confirm this because I think this particular film is completely lost. When you try and search anything up on this movie, you get the exact same 3 pictures. If you went on silenthollywood.com, you could find one other poster image of this particular movie, but other than that, there's nothing else. I also found this nice list of 7,200 lost silent films, but this film is absent from that list. Until then, I'll give Sangamon the benefit of a doubt, but this is the only place that states Bobby Watson was attached to this movie in any sort of capacity. If anybody knows if this film is actually lost or not, definitely let me know in the comments below because I'd love to be able to watch it and confirm if Bobby Watson's even in this film. This next section of the video, I talk about how early cinema is a really messy subject, and I accidentally spilled something on my shirt, so that's why. Shirt change. Early cinema is such a messy subject when you really start digging into the weeds. Not just for early controversies, but early cinema was so interconnected, not everyone had access to really, really expensive filmmaking equipment. So you get a lot of misinformation, offhanded accounts, etc., 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 and not to mention the fact that film preservation was basically a joke. So much information is just not available. It literally becomes a jigsaw puzzle where you're missing 75% of the puzzle pieces, yet you're still trying to form a coherent picture with it. Before we jump into the Hitler stuff, I do want to point out a couple of pre-Hitler Bobby Watson films that are available to watch. The first being the film Syncopation. It was the first Bobby Watson film to have sound. That up until recently, only 2 known prints of the film existed, with one of them being in a Russian archive. And up till today, the film was very, very rare to find. However, as of the making of this video, it actually has found its way online. Now, I don't know all the legal aspects of it making it online, whether it's public domain or not. But it's up there and it's very easy to find. And to me, I think that's great that people are going to be able to watch and enjoy the movie. For such a niche actor that's all but been forgotten to time, it's really nice that people are going to discover more and more of Bobby Watson's work. One of the things that makes Syncopation a landmark film was that it was the very first sound musical created by movie production company RKO. For the guy that's primarily known as playing Hitler, he's been a part of some really important movies in film history, which more on that closer to the end of the video. If I'm being completely honest with you, the film itself has a very early talkie film type of feel to it.
What'd the critics say about the show?
Oh, they said a lot of things. But don't you think you'd better wait until after breakfast? Gee, you must be hungry, dear.
Oh, don't try to kid me, Benny. I know the show's a flop. I just
no,
know
dear,
it.
no.
It is an early talkie, so you do have to go in with the mindset that, yeah, this was made about 80 years ago, but I think if you do that, you can find quite a bit to appreciate here. The dance number in particular for me stands out as very memorable. Sure, it's a stagnant, non-moving shot, but I like the angle of the camera, and then if you take the images from the film itself and run it through an upscaler, you get some pretty incredible looking pictures. Bobby Watson does have a pretty good performance though, in both his dancing and acting abilities. It's real easy to see why he was given a semi-lead role in the film. He does have quite a bit of range and emotion throughout the entire movie. And as I mentioned earlier, the dance number shows off that, yes, he was quite a dancer as well. I won't lie though, the performance does teeter on the old, aw shucks and gee willikers type of acting vibe that is rampant in this area of cinema. And while he doesn't completely leap off that edge, there are times where, yeah, you just kind of have to deal with it.
Flo said she'd meet me here after lunch. Gee whiz, what a swell hut.
Hey, if you like that style, I can absolutely respect that. For me though, pun completely intended, to me it just gets old. The thing though is Bobby is absolutely the best actor in the film. I did say he has a wide range here, and that's absolutely true. If I could give any sort of criticism story-wise, it does feel a bit disjointed on who they want their main character to be at times. And I think that's a detriment to Bobby's performance throughout the whole movie. And as you'll notice, a trend that will also follow him in his later Hitler performances. In Syncopation, he does too good of a job. And I think the biggest sin the film commits is that it attempts to focus on the ex-wife and millionaire love story of the movie instead of focusing on Bobby Watson. And if I'm just being completely honest, the ex-wife and the millionaire are they're not very good actors. And because of that, it does hurt Bobby's performance. And minor note, they try to paint Bobby as like a really crappy husband, so when the infidelity stuff starts happening, you're supposed to sympathize with the wife, but like I mentioned earlier, maybe it's because the other leads aren't that great of actors. I tend to empathize and sympathize more with Bobby. I might be overselling his acting a bit here, but I don't know. I thought it was pretty good. And I'd still say overall, for being Bobby's first sound picture that we know of, he does a really, really good job in it. Again, if you're interested, it is out there, and I recommend it. And now, let's shift gears slightly to touch on Glorious Vamps, which I was surprised to find out does not include vampires. I know, I'm an idiot. Back in the day, vamp was basically a term to describe people who sleep around a lot. The short itself basically stars Bobby Watson and co-star Nita Martin talking about wanting to date new people. So this is the actual plot. Bobby Watson travels through time in order to try and date famous women in history. Again, Bobby Watson's sort of the lead here, although I think it could be argued that Nita Martin is the lead as well, with the whole trippy song and dance routine at the end. But it's still a pre-Hitler performance where Bobby has a lead role. And once again, Bobby does a good job here. He's just got that presence about him. The quote I read earlier was really accurate. The dude really had something special. One thing to note, and as mentioned earlier, the end of the movie does turn into a song and dance, basically a song and dance acid trip. It's really strange. And that's saying something considering the plot is literally about Bobby Watson traveling through time to bang different people. Following this, Bobby would then go on to have minor roles for the next couple of decades. But having that major breakout role would still elude him. And you know, that's the kicker with fame. Sometimes it sneaks up on you in the most unexpected ways. Following World War I, Germany would find itself in a very strange place, and in 1933, Hitler and the Nazi regime would rise to power. And yes, this is a complete oversimplification of the events that would eventually lead to World War II. I'm not an authority figure on World War II, the politics, the battles, anything along those lines, although I do find the era very fascinating. There are plenty of other people that can talk about the scary rise of not only Hitler, but the Nazi regime in general, better than I ever could. If you want a good recommendation here on YouTube for video to watch, I'd recommend the channel The Great War, and more specifically their video entitled Adolf Hitler's First Steps in Politics, the Foundation of the Nazi Party. The video goes into detail on how Hitler would eventually come into power, and not only is it an entertaining video to watch, but it's also very informative, and I highly recommend it. The US wouldn't actually get involved with World War II until December 7th, 1941. This was because of the Pearl Harbor attack on Hawaii, with the event being dubbed the day that will live in infamy. And that's the day that everything changed, and not just at the cinemas, but for the US as a whole. However, it's also important to note that prior to Pearl Harbor, the US had actually had like minor scrimmages with the German forces, as well as we'd also kind of bent our neutrality rules to get weapons to the French. Again, a lot of this stuff is already known about today, and if you don't know, it's a pretty easy Google search. The important here, and to digress, is that the US didn't officially get involved with World War II until 1941. However, this didn't stop Hollywood from depicting the mad dictator in many different ways. Most notably, the Three Stooges short The Nazi Spy, and more famously, Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. There was even a Hitler in 1941 Citizen Kane. You could also point to this era of film as kind of the beginning of the Nazi-sploitation subgenre. And if you didn't know, yes, that's absolutely a thing. Now enter Bobby Watson.
He is not a German. He is, in Schopenhauer's words, the great master in the art of lying.
After the sale, you have my orders. Court-martial for any man who even mentions that I was here.
I mean, wow, resemblance is pretty uncanny. In terms of his heritage, Bobby Watson was of German descent. Which is also just as interesting, surprising, and ironic as you'd think it is. Because you'd think, okay, yeah, let's get a German guy to play a German, right? Makes sense. Till you find out that Hitler was Austrian. Which admittedly doesn't mean he isn't of German descent. However, we also don't know of Hitler's complete lineage, as Hitler was an illegitimate child and never actually knew his birth father. Some studies have even claimed Hitler might have been of Jewish and African descent, as ironic as that sounds. History.com has an interesting article that discusses how Belgian journalist Jean-Paul Mulders and historian Mark Vermeeren took samples from Hitler's living relatives, only to determine they all shared similar ancestry, creating a pathway to Jewish and African roots. There are some arguments against Hitler being of Jewish and African descent though, as again, a quick Google search will find a few historical experts that argue against those particular findings. Aside from these potential roots, other historians and researchers have even made the claim that Hitler may have been the product of inbreeding between his mother and grandfather. I know, huge tangent here, but I guess my point with this whole segment is it'd be kind of hilarious if in the long run we found out that Bobby Watson was a direct relative to Hitler. And, you know, honestly, just looking at them, I wouldn't be that surprised. Anyway, now with the typecasting of Bobby Watson, you'd think they'd only have him play Hitler in one type of movie, which, yeah, that does sound very strange when you say it out loud. However, of the 9 pictures he appeared as Hitler, they were in different types of movies. Sometimes they were semi-serious roles, other times comedies, or putting Hitler in funny situations. In one case, a serious dramatic work, semi-action movies, and sometimes they were more or less just cameos, or jokey cameos at that. You know, kind of like the modern day MCU. Now, we won't be covering all of Bobby Watson's portrayal as Hitler in depth today, for reasons I'll touch on when we get to those particular films. Some are less than 5-second cameos. Now, I will have quite a few different Amazon links below. These will direct you to the actual movies. And keep in mind, these aren't affiliate links or anything like that. You should also keep in mind that none of these are streaming for free, at least that I could find, so you will have to pay like a renting fee or a buying fee in order to watch them. The other works that are not available on Amazon are a bit more elusive to find. But we'll take a look at the different portrayals that range from more serious movies to comedies. Starting off, let's take a quick look at probably the most popular of Bobby Watson's Hitler films. Hitler, Dead or Alive, the first time Bobby Watson played the titular character in a feature film. However, this isn't the first time Bobby Watson portrayed Hitler on camera. It's actually the second time, the first time being in a short. That honor goes to the film entitled The Devil with Hitler, released in 1942, same as Hitler, Dead or Alive. A comedy short where the Lords of Death are basically about to replace Satan with Hitler as the new devil because Hitler has become more evil than freaking Satan. So, the devil must try to get Hitler to do a good deed. Any good deed. In order for Satan to continue being the devil. Yep, that's the actual plot. And the reason I'm not saying too much more than that is I wasn't able to find it and watch it for myself. It was high up on my list, but I couldn't watch it for myself, and I don't want to say too much if I haven't been able to view it, so sorry I couldn't say much more on this particular one. But I figured I should at least mention it here because had it not been for this role, the other times may have never happened. Bobby Watson was tapped to play the Nazi dictator for very obvious reasons, as we've already discussed. I'll touch on this a bit more when we get to the Nasty Nuisance, as it serves as a sort of direct sequel to The Devil and Hitler, but The Devil and Hitler and the Nasty Nuisance are often mislabeled as shorts, when in reality they are known as streamliners. Streamliners themselves were the brainchild of producer Hal Roach, his logic being they were a bit longer than a short, but a bit shorter than a feature, hence the name Streamliners. Again, we'll cover all that a bit more when we get there, including the purpose and function of a streamliner and the main reason for their discontinuation. Now, circling back to 1942's Hitler, Dead or Alive, there doesn't seem to be a lot of correlation between the production companies of The Devil with Hitler and Hitler, Dead or Alive. And as far as I can tell, but I mean, I could be wrong here, but neither of them seem to share any correlation between cast or production team. The Devil with Hitler premiered on October 18th, 1942, with a major release on October 22nd, 1942, while Hitler, Dead or Alive premiered November 12th, 1942, but didn't receive a wider release until April 3rd, 1943. I looked to see if maybe there was a connection between Hal Roach Studios and Ben Judell, Judell being the independent filmmaker who created Hitler, Dead or Alive, and as far as I can tell, the only connection they share was that, according to IMDb, both studios at one point in time worked with French distribution company Pathé, but they worked with Pathé years apart from one another, and that's about it when it comes to connections. One other possibility why Watson played Hitler hot potato with so many independent studios was the alliance known as the Society of Independent Motion Picture Producers, or SIMPS. I know, don't worry, I laughed at the name too. It contained independents like Orson Welles and Disney, to name a few notable filmmakers. SIMPS also included Hal Roach, so logically, all of these people knew each other personally, and you know the old saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And all of them had connections outside of just this particular film group. Again, like Hitler hot potato. I should note that there isn't a definitive answer out there as to how Watson got tapped for these Hitler pictures. I wish there was, because man, that sounds like an interesting story to tell. I digress though. Hitler, Dead or Alive, this movie, is freaking ridiculous.
Straight around, kid.
And if I'm completely transparent here, I don't know if I would have ever known about this movie or Bobby Watson in general had it not been for the Cinema Snob's old review of this movie from back in 2011. I remember this review very vividly back in the day, and even to this day, I still can't believe how ridiculous this movie is. I do have the Cinema Snob episode linked below, and you guys should check it out. I'd even go as far as to say his video is actually the genesis for this particular one, as Brad Jones was the first one I can recall mentioning how many times Bobby Watson had played Hitler in the past.
And this actor played Hitler in 9 different movies.
And color me surprised, because 11 years later, and I still haven't seen anyone else bring this up. Doing a quick YouTube search on the name Bobby Watson brings up nothing on the guy. Again, I still say you should check out the old Cinema Snob video about Hitler, Dead or Alive. Brad Jones does a good job in reviewing the movie, and there really isn't too much more I can add with my own thoughts on the film. If there was anything I can add to it, despite it having a pretty wacky and out there plot, I feel like it really encapsulates the whole subgenre of World War II propaganda flicks. It's bold, out there, crazy, and at the end of the day is about fighting some freaking Nazis. Out of all the movies that I talk about today, if you're only gonna watch one, let it be this. Its runtime isn't very long, and I'd say for the most part, it's a pretty enjoyable watch. Before we move on, let's touch on Bobby Watson's performance here. Now, I don't think he quite hit his stride playing the character yet. However, that could be done on purpose. He's made to look very weak, and the character himself is basically meant to be buried, which to me does make sense. It is a World War II picture depicting Hitler, and yeah, you'd want to bury the guy. In terms of screen time, he really isn't in the movie too terribly long, only appearing in the last 10 minutes of the movie. Despite playing the Mad Dictator prior to this, I don't feel like Bobby had completely found his footing as Hitler. His portrayal of the character would get better as his appearances went on, though. Next up on Bobby Watson's filmography is 1943's The Nasty Nuisance, also carrying the alternate title of The Last Three, the quote-unquote sequel to The Devil and Hitler. Spoiler, it's not. I guess you can stretch that it's the same continuity, you know, him playing Hitler and all, and I don't want to spoil too much on the video, but later this will kind of come into play with another movie, but we'll get to that when we get there. Which to me is kind of hilarious, because we could technically stretch the continuity with Hitler and say he's kind of like the modern-day Spider-Man in the MCU. He's both in it and not in it when it's convenient for both studios. And yes, I do know that Hal Roach Studio made this film as well, so it's not exactly like the MCU, it's more like the Sony-verse, or the Sony Spider-Verse, I should say. Anyway, The Nasty Nuisance tells the story of a group of US sailors led by Captain Spence, who, after their ship was destroyed by what I assume was a Nazi submarine...
Those torpedoes are so small and this ocean is so big, I'll bet there's some way that we could sort of steer around them if we could just figure it out.
Come across a tropical island where, coincidentally, Hitler will be arriving soon as the guest of honor in order to sign a treaty with the chief of the island. General Sukiyaki, and Mussolini accompany him as well because they just kinda want to, I guess.
I'm a Polito. I just don't want to see you get lost on the front, so I follow you behind.
The line is a little on the nose when it came to Italy fighting on the Western Front of the war. Hey, Google's my friend. But even without Googling this, you can just tell that this joke had something to do with the war going on. I don't think it's that big of a surprise to hear the whole film is littered with these little war jokes, quote unquote, which is pretty standard for the time.
There will be one kind, one people, one right.
That's right.
One thing to keep in mind is the whole movie is littered with stereotypes, racism, etc. And not just towards the Nazis, it's a 1940s World War II propaganda short comedy. I don't think I need to explain any further than that. If you're watching this film in 2022, you probably have an idea of what you're getting yourself into with this particular movie. Speaking of stereotypes though, my god, the dude playing Mussolini, actor Joe Devlin, Jesus, his Italian accent is so freaking over the top at points. I legit feel like he's a second away from going,
"It's me, Mario!"
For the rest of the movie, hijinks ensue. A wacky dinner, a wacky magic show, a wacky pillow fight with a monkey, all while the American troops slowly kick the crap out of the Nazis, and trick Hitler and company into believing the islanders will ultimately kill them in the morning, thus causing them to retreat. Hitler and company flee the island and retreat to their sub, only the Americans now control the sub. For some reason or another, the Americans decide to not tell Hitler, Mussolini, and Sukiyaki that they're in the control of the sub or anything. They play it off like he's still in charge for some reason. The captain even tells the other main character that they're prisoners of war, so they can't lay a hand on it. Which again, it would probably be more effective if they knew they were prisoners, but, I digress. The other main character then gets the idea to scare the crap out of them, pretending they're sinking into the ocean. The three then turn on each other, but before they can kill each other, the crew then decide to tell the Axis powers that they are prisoners of war. Again, why they didn't do this in the beginning, I don't know, but the Axis powers then decide to beat the crap out of each other. And the plot just literally decides to go off the rails completely, crescendoing when the sub crash lands on another island. Hitler and the Axis then jump into the torpedo chutes and are blasted into the side of a dirt mound. The film itself definitely lives up to the title of Streamliner though, as it feels like 2 or 3 different movies that were strung together and about 30 or 40 minutes worth of it trimmed out. The trimmed out sections in my mind being those that would kind of nicely transition the whole Hitler, Island, and submarine storylines together. So you might know the name Hal Roach from either Laurel and Hardy or the Our Gang short, which are also known as the Little Rascals, just to name a few franchises that he's been a part of. I'm oversimplifying the hell out of Hal Roach's early career, but he found a lot of success in the film industry. The whole concept for creating streamliners was to aid in situations with double features. You wouldn't put 2 2-hour films back to back, that would just be too long. You wouldn't make as much money that way. Therefore, you could put a streamliner up front, followed by the bigger film afterwards. You can look at streamliners as kind of like a warm-up act, but were they a hit? Only 22 streamliners were made by Hal Roach Studios, 20 of which were under the United Artists banner, with Hal Roach himself giving the format the axe, mainly due to them not worth the cost in production. A quote I found on Wikipedia had Roach stating, quote, "They should have cost $150,000 a piece, but they ran from $300,000 to $400,000, and they weren't worth that much money. We lost about $1 million." On the creation of the Nazty Nuisance, Hal Roach was a commissioned officer in the US Army, and he was called up to active duty in 1942, a year prior to the release of the Nazty Nuisance. During this time, his studio helped to create a lot of military training videos and propaganda-styled films. There isn't any sort of direct quote on the brainchild for this movie's creation, but one could assume for obvious reasons it fits comfortably in the propaganda-styled film genre. As for Bobby Watson in the film, you can definitely see his strengths as the straight man shine through in his comedy routine. No matter how zany the comedy gets, he acts and really makes you believe this is exactly how Hitler would act in a given situation, playing it for the most part seriously. I'm sure even back then, everyone knew how ridiculous of a premise this whole movie was, and with him playing the straight man, I don't know, to me it just really stands out. You know, aside from the fact that he's playing Hitler. Sure, he does ham it up in that over-the-top 1940s cinema way occasionally, but even in those scenes, he's quickly overacted by someone else, leading to his overacting feeling a bit tamed and reserved in a positive way. And once again, he really does stand out as something somewhat special in this movie. Quick tangent, but in terms of how the film was shot, it isn't anything too special, save for a few key shots that actually look pretty good. They also clearly use rear projection techniques in quite a few different shots, but honestly, the way they shoot it, it's pretty convincing. Like this one here where the MC and love interest are looking at the village overhead. It isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and you could tell it's rear projection, but it's still pretty nice, and scale-wise, it's done quite well. So I gotta hand it to him there. If you can stomach the obvious like racism and stereotyping of the Islanders, I'd say give this one a watch because there are elements into it that are worth watching today. Before we move on to the next film, let's take a quick look at Bobby Watson behind the scenes during his main run as the Mad Dictator. According to IMDb and the Sangamon County website, while on set, Watson would face a lot of hostility from coworkers and just people in general. It was in the middle of World War II and he was dressed as Hitler. You'd be obliterated today even if you walked around even remotely dressed up like Hitler, and this was 80 years ago. I can't even imagine doing this in the 40s at the height of the conflict. Here's the thing though, there isn't a lot of information to prove this is true. And at first, I legit thought this was just another IMDb fantasy. However, after doing some digging, I did find an article from website oldmagazinearticles.com. It's a brief snippet, but the article is entitled The Loneliest Man in Hollywood. To summarize, Bobby Watson lived alone in his trailer on the outskirts of Hollywood, and it stated that he hated his appearance as Hitler. Well, I don't blame him. The article goes more into the Hitler gang, which I assume this article was written for at the time. From the picture and what the article states, we can infer that, yeah, it probably was pretty tough for him during this time frame. One thing to remember is that the guy was just an actor. And what's the old saying? When the opportunity knocks, you open the door, right? Just looking at the picture, he does look a bit miserable, but again, this is the only article we have to go on. It's entirely possible it was written in a way to place Bobby Watson's time here in a negative light. Not as a slight on Bobby, but more on Hitler himself. I do wish there was more to the article, but that's about all we have to go on. Quick side note, on the Sangamon County website, there's actually a picture of Bobby Watson playing the ukulele. He's not completely dressed up as Hitler, he still has the chaplain on there, but if you ever wanted to see a Hitler look-alike play the ukulele, well, there you go. As World War II continued on through the 40s, so did Bobby Watson's career playing the dictator of Germany. Next up would be the 6th time Bobby Watson would appear on screen as Hitler in what would be his only lead role in a full-length feature film, Hitler Gang, a somewhat serious interpretation of the Mad Führer's rise to power. I say somewhat because the film isn't very accurate, but it is taken very seriously. The film was released on April 26, 1944, which is almost 1 year to the day that Hitler would commit suicide, that being on April 30th, 1945, meaning Hitler himself died in between this and the release of Duffy's Tavern, released on September 28th, 1945. Technically, Hitler's death would have taken place between Duffy's Tavern and Henry Aldrich's Little Secret, which was released on June 10th, 1944. In the article on The Loneliest Man in Hollywood, it stated that in order to prepare for the Hitler Gang, Bobby Watson spent 12 days studying 30,000 feet of German newsreels, which, if it was shot on 35mm at 24 frames per second, you'd be looking at roughly 5 hours, 33 minutes, and 20 seconds worth of footage. And that's just utilizing an online calculator. However, if it's a newsreel, it might not have been 24 frames per second, or even shot on 35mm. It might have even been slower than that. Just as an example, I plugged the numbers in again, and this time I went to 18 frames a second, still at 35mm though, and you're looking at 7 hours, 24 minutes, and 26 seconds worth of footage. Now, imagine a dude who already hates having to act as the guy, spending 12 days attempting to perfect his speech and mannerisms. Something the article states Bobby Watson was attempting to do. The point is, for the time frame, the guy did put in the work, and you have to at least respect the commitment he had for the role. So, how well does the film stack up? And what about Bobby Watson's performance? Well, let's take a look at the film itself, and sorry, the quality on this is really bad. I couldn't find like a really nice looking version of it. Hitler Gang was a Paramount production starring Bobby Watson in the titular role. The film itself details the rise of Nazism in Germany and how Hitler would rise to power in the country. The pacing itself is almost like a gangster flick, if that makes sense. It's often labeled as such online, and when you watch it, yeah, you definitely get that vibe. The film starts off in a hospital at the tail end of World War I, where we have a young Adolf Hitler in the hospital claiming to be blind after an attack. The doctors state that it's hysteria and paranoia, but he will make a full recovery.
But he insists that he can't see.
He probably can't. Case of hysteria, shock.
He feels that he is persecuted. Everyone is against him.
After the fall of the Kaiser in Germany, we see some soldiers taking down the portraits of the previous Kaiser, and they allude to the fact that a new dictator will eventually take his place, with a young Hitler standing nearby. If I can go off on a slight tangent, I'm kind of shocked to see one of the soldiers actually say that the German people are tired and don't want another person like them in power, which is a little crazy seeing as how this is still a propaganda-style film.
People have had enough of the Kaiser and his kind. They've had enough of war.
And I think it's good. It was showing that not everyone was excited for another world war, especially since the opening title card straight up says a few people were already planning the next world war. I think it's kind of cool that they showed that, in fairness, not everyone was excited to have another dictator come to power, but I digress. Hitler then receives his trademark chaplain with the shadow of the former Kaiser looming in the background. In all honesty, it's actually a pretty haunting shot, and that's something that will echo throughout the remainder of the film, if not for the symbolism beating you over the head, especially with the German soldiers talking about the war's end. Still, this particular scene serves its purpose. And almost immediately following this, the whole gangster flick vibe is felt, with the remnants of the German forces already planning a coup. Hitler being the rat who lets the head quote-unquote boss know about the potential coup. The way they're discussing everything comes off less political and more gang-heavy. Hitler then infiltrates the Workers' Union Party, going undercover. After a while, Hitler becomes the leader of the political party, and then randomly, during one of the political party discussions, they attempt to place blame on another random minority group for the loss of World War I, when randomly someone just says, the Jews, and Hitler just goes off.
The Jews are a minority group.
The Jews.
The Jews started the war!
You know, it's sad because the way they play it off, it does work into the opening line with the doctor saying, oh, he's paranoid and delusional. But here, the way they present Hitler's disdain for Jewish people is very unintentionally comical. And I'm not joking either. Like, having him randomly, because someone else just randomly brought up Jewish people, he's now decided that he hated them. And that's it. The truth of the matter is, we actually don't have a concrete reason as to why Adolf Hitler hated Jewish people so much. Yeah, sure, we can speculate and everything, but there's no definitive answer. That's one of the things that made him and still makes him a terrifying person to this day. We have so many accounts of his atrocious acts as a human, but we don't have the exact reason for that hate. Compound that with the fact that he was able to rise to power and almost take over the world. I think this is sufficient enough to keep anyone awake at night, even today. Not knowing the exact reason is actually a lot more frightening than if we ever knew. So that's why in Hitler Gang it comes off as cheap and unintentionally funny. Yeah, this is a propaganda film and they want him to come off as insane. I don't know, but for me personally, I don't feel like the film needed to make this part up.
The truth. What is the truth? It's something you've heard so often that you accept it as the truth.
The point of the film is to be somewhat frightening, and what's more frightening than a madman rising to power without a complete answer as to why they're doing it? In fact, thinking about it now, they could have cut the opening hospital scene out entirely. I think it would have made Hitler's hatred of Jewish people feel more authentic and terrifying as a viewer, even back in the 1940s. Instead, we just kind of already know that the dude's nuts.
I have nothing to do with logic. Logic is the business of little minds.
Now, I was a little surprised, but they do show the point where Hitler does go to jail during his first attempted Nazi coup, and I'm honestly a bit surprised they showed this happening at all. Again, they do also bring up Mein Kampf, although hilariously Bobby Watson calls it Mein Kampf.
I shall call it Mein Kampf. That's what it really is, my battle.
And even funnier, the dude corrects him right afterwards with the correct pronunciation.
Mein Kampf, wonderful. Here is the pamphlet.
This might all seem like minor nitpicks, but it's just kind of hilarious that the major things that should be the foundation and building blocks of this entire movie are just basically glossed over throughout the entire thing. I also should mention that when Hitler meets his niece Gelle Robel, they make the music very whimsically.
Oh, here's my daughter. You come? Speak to your uncle.
Rudolph, I want you to meet my family. This is Gary, my sister Angela.
Because if you didn't know, yeah, Hitler did fall in love with his niece. It's a really awkward scene in general because the way they position the music, it's almost like you're supposed to be kind of rooting for them. Even though you remember that it's his niece. Did I mention that it's really freaking awkward? This does change a bit later with the scene of Hitler going into his niece's room. They change the music from being all, whimsically and slowly transition it to this spidery, creepy kind of soundtrack, finally crescendoing this awkward, creepy, terrifying vibe with Gelle whimpering as we fade to black. It's genuinely unnerving. I'll give them this. With the combination of dark and foreboding lighting mixed with the music, the scene is really effective in unnerving and creeping the hell out of you for very obvious reasons. I will say though, I do feel like they could have done this whole thing better. I think the soundtrack at the very beginning when you meet Gelle is a little too whimsical, and the way they almost paint the picture, it's like, oh, you're supposed to love the fact that they're in love, and it's like, nah, wait, they could have done this. They could have done this better, but anyway, again, I digress. After this, the whole tone of the movie just kind of shifts, and they literally just start running through all the main beats of Hitler's rise to power. Now, I won't go through the whole film beat for beat, as we'll basically be here all day. I mainly wanted to show that the film isn't exactly accurate in showing Hitler's rise to power. There's a lot of similarities, sure, and some of the stuff is fairly on point, but it's missing a lot of details, which becomes very apparent after the Gelle murder scene, and the film just literally starts pole vaulting to the finale. To be fair, I think we take a lot of the details for granted today, because back then, I don't think the information was as readily available as to how a monster like Hitler would rise to power, aside from like Nazi propaganda. At least not until the end of World War II. So getting a completely accurate and historical movie about Adolf Hitler in 1944 was gonna be next to impossible. Another glaring problem with the movie is points that really should be focal and talked about are just kind of glossed over. I know I just complained about the whole Jewish thing happening, but if they're gonna bring it up, I don't know, maybe they should expand on it a bit more, other than just saying, oh, Hitler's crazy and this one guy brought up Jewish people. The other is the introduction of the swastika. It just kind of shows up at the beginning of the movie in one of their political discussion sections. They even gloss over the forming of the Nazis in general and just jump to a few years later when the Nazi party has way more members. This could be, again, because they didn't know how exactly all this stuff happened, but I mean, if they were just gonna make stuff up anyway, I feel like they probably should have put something in there. I think that kind of segues to the kind of the weakest part of the whole film, and that's the script. A lot of it is super blatant foreshadowing by all the characters around Hitler. Honestly, it comes off as really distracting. And overall, because the writing is pretty subpar at best, it hurts a lot of the really, really stand-up performances. There are some very good performances that get dragged down by the weak script. One of the first ones that popped into my head was the actor who played the previous general of World War I, which I can't remember the name off the top of my head now, but I'll put the name of him in the video here. Now, for Watson's performance, I've alluded to it, but Jesus, it's a real shame this didn't jumpstart his career as a character actor in villainous roles, because, man, at points in this film, he is freaking haunting.
I must do it. I must sacrifice them for the good of Germany.
Again, though, his performance is mostly held down by an extremely weak script. Man, if he was given a halfway decent script in any other movie where they just let him be a villain, I could easily see him playing a genuinely haunting and memorable guy. I guess haunting is like the theme of this particular video. And it's kind of a shame we didn't get to see him flex his more villainous acting chops in other roles. I get it, he's the Hitler guy, but did nobody in Hollywood think to give this dude a serious villain role? This is speculation on my part, but maybe Bobby Watson didn't like playing villains. It's always possible this role had such a negative influence in his life he never took another serious villain role like this. We did see earlier that he received a lot of backlash just from appearing in this particular film. I do think that's unlikely though, because as you'll see, he didn't exactly stop playing Hitler. Personally, I think he might have unintentionally blacklisted himself from playing any other major roles like this. Again, it's hard to shake the stigma when in Hollywood you're known as the guy who plays freaking Hitler. As for the movie itself overall, I do think it's actually worth a watch. Now, let me be clear here, I don't think it's that good. If you're a history buff, which I'm not, but even I found a lot of the lack of historical accuracy really bothersome. And if I did, and you're any sort of history buff, you're going to as well. I also think treating the whole thing like a gangster flick when it's supposed to be a quote-unquote accurate depiction is hard to shake at the start of the film. I've mentioned before this was meant to be a propaganda film, and it does work there. As a propaganda film, it does paint the Nazi Party as very, very evil and very, very weak, willing to turn on each other at the drop of a hat. And as a propaganda film, it does its job. However, the problem is that it could have still been a propaganda film and an effective one without relying on this. And again, I do appreciate the fact that it does show that not all the Germans were on Hitler's side. They could have taken the easy route and said that, oh, all of them just, hated everybody and wanted to start another war. And because in truth, a lot of the Germans did stand up to him. I think it would have been a much more effective and powerful movie if the good people that were standing against him failed in stopping his rise to power as Hitler did. And they took it a little bit more serious. I feel like it would have also made things kind of come full circle at the very ending of the movie when there's the big montage of the Allied forces coming to take on Hitler, but that's just my opinion.
And all over the world, good men did find arms. Good men of 55 nations fought shoulder to shoulder against the aggressor. And to this task, 3/4 of the people of the world pledged their lives and their sacred honor.
Looking past the weak script and odd explanations thrown in here and there as to why Hitler was the way he was, Bobby Watson's performance is a standout here. Even comparing some of the real Hitler speeches and Bobby Watson's portrayal is very, very striking. Like, you can definitely tell he spent a lot of time studying the man. And you can also tell that Bobby Watson went out of his way to make this role work. I will say again, it's a shame it was held back by a lackluster screenplay. A slight tangent, but one of the other things I did like was some of the cinematography in the film. It has a very noir feel to it with a lot of heavy shadows. The cinematography and Bobby Watson alone make this movie worth watching at least once. One last note for the film. There's quite a few times throughout the movie that Bobby Watson's Hitler will bring up suicide or allude to suicide or something along those lines, and what I think is really weird and genuinely kind of a freaky coincidence is this movie would come out almost a year to the date of Hitler's suicide. So yeah, it's just a really, really weird coincidence. One other quick tangent. The film was directed by John Farrow, who would later go on to make Around the World in 80 Days. And what's funny is I've harped on the writing and the screenplay a lot in this particular video, so I looked up who the writers were. The film was written by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, with contributing writing coming from Kurt Newman and Herman Rauschning. What's funny is Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett 2 years later would go on to write It's a Wonderful Life. Life is strange. According to IMDb, prior to the release of Hitler Gang, Bobby Watson made 2 other appearances as Adolf Hitler. The first being 1945's Don't Be a Sucker, which is mislabeled on IMDb as being released in 1943. Don't Be a Sucker actually released after Hitler Gang came out. And it's very easy to tell if you watch Don't Be a Sucker. They literally just reuse footage from Hitler Gang. Yep, another IMDb fail. The worst part is a quick Google search will tell you the actual date this released. It's even available to watch right now on YouTube via the US National Archives YouTube channel in a very, very high quality. And funny enough, this short actually tells the story about the rise of Hitler and the Nazis way better than Hitler Gang did. The film itself is a propaganda piece created right after World War II. It talks about how through complacency of people, Hitler and the Nazis rose to power, all under the tagline of people being suckered. Either the people following the Nazis or the people who believed it wasn't their problem to deal with the Nazis. Bobby Watson, this is nothing more than a glorified cameo. I'd say it's something akin to the Captain America Jim Easter egg cameo that pops up every now and again in the MCU. The second was The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, which did release before Hitler Gang, hitting theaters on January 19th, 1944. Not much to say about this one in terms of Bobby Watson, as him playing Hitler here really, again, is a glorified cameo appearance. And this one's a little special, if only for one particular reason. It's not even necessarily because of Bobby Watson. It's because it's played by the same guy who played Mussolini in the Nasty Nuisance. Joe Devlin reprises his role as the leader of Italy, Benito Mussolini. It literally isn't more than a few seconds long, and you could also say the same for Bobby Watson's cameo. The thing is, The Nasty Nuisance is technically a sequel to The Devil with Hitler, and by extension that means this is all a part of the same cinematic universe. Obviously, I'm kidding, because even when you look at the old Universal Horror Monsters continuity, that's all over the damn place as well, but it is a funny notion trying to connect everything together. Not really much more to say about these two films, because, again, Bobby Watson's Hitler, more or less, in retrospect, are just glorified cameos, which does segue us into our next film, The Story of Mankind. I know I've made a lot of Avengers/Marvel references in the video already, but let's do one more and look at The Story of Mankind, where once again, Bobby Watson plays Hitler. The reason I compare it to the Avengers is its story that combines many historical figures from Earth's history: Joan of Arc, Cleopatra, Nero, and of course, Hitler. It doesn't really stop there though, because the film does have a who's who of big name actors, not necessarily just for the time, but in the future as well. You got the man himself, Vincent Price, playing the devil essentially, Peter Lorre playing Nero, a young Dennis Hopper as Napoleon, you got Groucho Marx, Hedy Lamarr, and I mean, Jesus, there's a lot of big names attached to this film. It's like the Avengers of the 50s, they just didn't know it at the time. Or, a version of the Universal Horror Monsters, but the 50s. Once again, to put it into perspective, Bobby Watson's first portrayal as Hitler was in 1942's The Devil and Hitler, and this movie was released in 1957. This means at this point in his career, he had played the same character for 15 years. For reference, Hugh Jackman started playing Wolverine in 2000, and Logan came out in 2017, so at this time frame, Bobby Watson had almost surpassed Hugh Jackman's portrayal as Wolverine. And literally the day I started shooting this, it was announced that Hugh Jackman was going to be in Deadpool 3. So, I mean, all bets are off, right? During the last 10 minutes of the movie, Bobby Watson appears for a whopping 26 seconds of screen time in a colorized version of his Hitler character. The first time he ever appeared in color as the character to deliver a couple lines of dialogue. And once again, the few moments he's on screen, his portrayal leaves a haunting and terrifying vibe, which regrettably isn't expanded on much further in the movie. I can't help but think of how much of a missed opportunity this film had, especially with how underrated of an actor Bobby Watson was. On the one hand, you've got freaking Vincent Price, who's a certifiable legend. And on the other hand, you've got the definitive version of Hitler on screen in this particular movie. I don't know, I feel like something more could have been done here. Again, maybe someday I'll come back and talk more about this film. Moving on though, we have 1961's On the Double. Again, it's another blink and you miss it cameo by Bobby Watson. Towards the end of the movie, main character Private First Class Ernie Williams, played by actor Danny Kaye, is being chased by a bunch of Nazis in Berlin. He attempts to get away from them by dressing up in a bunch of different outfits and trying to give them the slip. At one point, he attempts to sort of crappily dress up as Hitler before bumping into the real Hitler, played by, you guessed it, Bobby Watson. And it's played up in a humorous, slapsticky way. Overall, I actually enjoyed watching this movie and recommend it. The whole movie's got this 60s slapstick vibe to it, with also a bit of a spy vibe as well. A bit Austin Powers-y, if that makes sense. The bit at the end with Hitler is pretty funny too. With all the random chaotic mess that's going on, having Bobby Watson show up to just be like, wait, what the hell is this guy doing? I gotta admit, made me laugh pretty hard. After On the Double, Bobby Watson would make his final appearance on screen as Hitler in Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, at least according to IMDb. And it's wrong. Keep in mind, this movie's 2.5 hours long, so it's entirely possible he's in like a throwaway shot, or I just missed him entirely. I went and skimmed through the whole movie again just to make sure he wasn't in there, and nope, he isn't anywhere in sight. Thanks, IMDb. Although, if Watson isn't in the film, I think I know where people get him mixed up at. At the 29-minute mark of the movie, there's this whole segment shot in red where it's of Hitler's famous speech in Berlin in 1939. They mix stock footage with newly shot footage here, and there are a couple of shots where they show the real Hitler on camera. And I think whoever stated that Bobby Watson played Hitler in this movie got it confused and thought it was a Bobby Watson performance. In fairness, 2 points. One being, when this was originally shot, the intermingling of new footage and stock footage, I think would have came out quite a bit better if you would have saw this back in the theaters in the day. Watching it now on flat screen high definition TVs makes it easier to spot when they'd mix stock footage, no matter how hard they tried to cover it up or make it fit into the film. And 2, for better or worse, and I don't know if this is exactly a compliment to Bobby Watson or not, but it really is a testament to just how much the two looked alike. So that would mean Bobby Watson only appeared on screen as Hitler 8 times, spanning between 1942 and 1961. So that would mean Bobby Watson's final film on screen was his cameo in the film On the Double. You know, I didn't actually catch that in the very beginning, and I've kind of been scripting this as I've gone along and done my research, and I still think I'm going to keep that in. I think it's kind of funny that even after all those years ago watching the Cinema Snob video, that IMDb's been wrong about this the entire time. It also goes to show that even though we think we've cataloged a lot on the internet correctly, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Still, for what it's worth, I enjoyed On the Double and see it as a nice end to Bobby Watson's legacy. You get a mixture of comedy and Hitler. Perfect. It's kind of a shame because going out on a film entitled The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse sounds freaking awesome, but, you know, reality is often less romanticized than we perceive it to be. But, you know, life is strange sometimes. It's entirely possible there are other films he starred in post On the Double, and if it came to light, maybe I'll create a follow-up video in the future or something like that. Hey, at the very least, he went out playing the role he's most notable for. Before we finish up here and close out and talk about Bobby Watson's post-film life, I do want to quickly bring up one more film. Now, I wanted to mostly focus on Bobby Watson's early career and what led to his roles starring as Hitler. I've already stated previously that I think that Bobby Watson was not only an underrated, but he was a very underappreciated actor from his era, and I've kind of felt like, I don't know, just talking about the Hitler movies and ending it on that would be doing a major disservice to Bobby Watson's work as a whole. I mentioned early on in this research, kind of offhandedly, that Bobby Watson seemed to be connected to a lot of firsts and semi-important films in his early years. This statement held true even post the 1940s and into the 50s. Let me direct you to Bobby Watson's uncredited role in 1951's Singin' in the Rain. Yep, Bobby Watson was in Singin' in the Rain, and even though it was an uncredited role and a bit part, it was still a memorable role. Singin' in the Rain needs no introduction. It's one of the most famous movies of all time. Now, transparently, it's not really my cup of tea per se. I have a poster of Lethal Panther on my wall. I don't think it's that far of a stretch to say I'm a huge connoisseur of the finest of arts. But for what it's worth, Singin' in the Rain is a classic and deserves all the accolades it has received over the decades. It has that old Hollywood charm to it, and to say it inspired hundreds if not thousands of films, I believe would be an understatement. Now with that out of the way, Bobby Watson played the part of diction coach in the Moses Supposed bit of the movie. The scene in Bobby Watson's role is played up for a laugh, again showing his strength as the straight man. He plays so well off the two leads, it really brings the whole scene together. Hey, like I said, the dude was talented. He was just a hidden talent. Bobby Watson would remain a relatively smaller star in the entertainment industry as the years went on. Before completely exiting the entertainment business and before his final film roles, Bobby Watson did have a few small roles on the Rin Tin Tin TV show and another show entitled Highway Patrol, just to name a few. In fact, he actually had quite a few roles on television, but again, they were smaller roles. The man was, for his time, the king of minor role actors. For his time in the entertainment industry, he will forever be known as the guy who played Hitler the most times on screen, and all because he had a passing look for the man. If there was ever an argument for destiny being a thing, you could easily throw Bobby Watson in there as potential evidence. Back on the Sangamon website, they state that Bobby Watson spent a majority of his time between the 1930s and early 40s living in his trailer. I never did come across an exact number or anything as to how much Bobby Watson was paid to play Hitler, but he did keep coming back to the role for decades, so I imagine it wasn't too bad. Bobby was known to be a bit of a traveler and a vagabond of sorts, as he would travel back and forth to his hometown in Springfield, Illinois to visit family and such. And it also seemed as though he really did enjoy traveling, specifically in the Southwest to Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, stuff like that. On the Sangamon website, there are a few pictures on there that aren't anywhere else online showing Bobby Watson living in the Southwest, and showing his love and appreciation of the West. There are also some early pictures of him in his acting career and on stage. Seriously, if you're interested, go check this website out. It's been unbelievably helpful in putting this video together. So that was the story of the loneliest man in Hollywood, Bobby Watson. Going through mainly his Hitler films, but also diving into some other projects he's been a part of, really opens your eyes just to how talented the man was as an actor. His versatility was kinda insane when you think about it. He could play the straight man, he could play the screwball, and even an insane dictator. He may be forever known as the guy who played Hitler, but in a way his performance paved the way for other people in the future, whether that was playing the mad dictator himself or other villainous characters. Because let's face it, when you think of Hitler in the movies, at least during this time frame, this is who you're thinking about. And I mean, I think the guy is severely underrated. I still hold firm that had they tapped him to play more villainous characters in other pictures, he could have potentially been a defining actor for that era, at least in villainous type roles, in my opinion. But what do you think? Do you feel like Bobby Watson was a very underrated actor and that he could have gone on to bigger and better roles, or do you think his legacy is just about right? Let me know in the comments below. Despite where you feel Bobby Watson's legacy lies or whether or not he deserved more, it does make me wonder how many other actors from old Hollywood have suffered similar fates to Bobby Watson. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video and thank you very much for watching.